Just after midnight on August 10, 1931, a strange-looking truck pulled out of New York City heading west. Inside were three exhausted men, two bunk beds, a cooking stove, and strapped down in the cargo bed, a full-size Indianapolis race car. The truck had no radio, no power steering, and, as its crew would discover coming down a California mountain 5 days later, not nearly enough brakes. What it had was an engine that almost nobody in America believed belonged on a highway. An engine the experts said was for ships, submarines, and power plants. An engine whose own inventor had walked onto a steamship 18 years earlier and vanished into the North Sea. A diesel. The man behind the wheel had bet his company, his reputation, and his patron's family fortune that this engine could conquer American trucking. His company had never turned a profit, not once in 12 years. His biggest customer had already returned 4,500 of his engines and canceled the contract. And when he tried to show his invention at the New York Auto Show the year before, they wouldn't even let him in the building. 5 days after leaving New York, that truck rolled into Los Angeles, 3,214 miles. Total fuel bill, $11.22. This is the story of Clessie Cummins, the self-taught mechanic who gave America the diesel truck, whether America wanted it or not. And it's the story of how the most terrifying 35 miles of that trip planted an idea in his head that decades later would become the sound every trucker in the world knows, invented for the company that carried his name and rejected by it. So here's the setup. It's 1919, and the American truck runs on gasoline. All of it. The Great War has just ended, and it changed everything about how the country moves. The Army proved that motor trucks could do what railroads couldn't. Go the last mile, go anywhere there's a road, and sometimes anywhere there isn't. Surplus trucks are flooding the civilian market. A new industry is being born on the back of the gasoline engine. And the gasoline engine, for trucking, has problems. It's thirsty. It's fragile under sustained load. Its fuel is the expensive, refined, volatile top-shelf product of the oil barrel. For a farmer or a freight hauler counting pennies, fuel cost isn't a line item. It's the whole business. There was, in theory, an alternative. 2 decades earlier, a Rudolph diesel had patented an engine that needed no spark plugs, no carburetor, no ignition system at all. Squeeze air hard enough and it gets hot enough to ignite fuel all by itself. Compression ignition. The result was an engine that ran on cheap, heavy, almost unrefinable oil, the stuff closer to what you'd burn in a furnace than what you'd put in a Cadillac, and extracted more work from every drop than any gasoline engine could dream of. Diesel himself never saw where it would lead. In September 1913, he boarded a steamer crossing the English Channel, dined, retired to his cabin, and was never seen alive again. His body was found in the sea 10 days later. Suicide, accident, or something darker? Historians still argue, and we may do a full file on it someday. But the engine outlived the man. By 1919, the diesel engine had found a home, just not on land. It powered ocean-going ships. It powered submarines on both sides of the war. It sat in basements generating electricity. It was heavy, slow-revving, industrial. The consensus across the entire automotive world was unanimous and comfortable. A diesel was a stationary engine that occasionally floated. The idea of putting one in a truck, a machine that had to be light, quick, and cheap, was regarded as somewhere between eccentric and stupid. Which brings us to a chauffeur in Columbus, Indiana, who disagreed. Clessie Cummins was born on an Indiana farm in 1988, and by every account, he was one of those boys who understood machines the way other people understand language. No engineering degree, no formal training worth mentioning. He built a working steam engine as a child. He fixed things nobody else could fix. In 1908, a wealthy Columbus banker named William Glanton Irwin hired the 20-year-old Clessie for a very practical reason. Irwin had bought an automobile, and automobiles in 1908 needed a full-time human being to keep them running. Clessie became the family's driver and mechanic. And here's an early detail that tells you where this story is headed. By several accounts, in 1911, young Clessie worked as a member of the pit crew at a brand new race in Indianapolis, the very first running of the 500-mile race, supporting the winning Marmon Wasp effort. Remember that. The Indianapolis 500 is going to come back into this story in a way nobody in 1911 could have predicted. The relationship between the mechanic and the banker deepened into something rare. Irwin didn't just employ Clessie, he believed in him. He set him up with his own machine shop, and on February 3, 1919, with Irwin supplying the starting capital, the Cummins Engine Company was founded in Columbus, Indiana, on a single conviction that the entire industry considered a dead end, that Rudolph Diesel's engine, cheap to feed, nearly impossible to kill, belonged on American roads. Conviction, however, doesn't pay wages. What paid wages, briefly, was Sears. The company's first real business came through a license to build a simple Dutch-designed oil engine, the Vid, as a small farm engine. Sears, Roebuck and Company, the giant mail-order retailer, agreed to sell them through the catalog. The order was enormous for a tiny Indiana shop. Thousands of little single-cylinder engines, 1.5 to 3 horsepower, sold to farmers across America under the Thermoil name. It nearly destroyed the company. The engines had teething problems, and worse, the business model had a hole in it big enough to drive a harvest through. Sears offered generous return policies. Farmers, being sensible people in hard times, figured out the obvious play. Buy an engine before the harvest, work it hard for the season, and then send it back. Thousands of engines came back. Sears declared the engines defective and canceled the whole contract by 1922. A rational investor would have walked away. The Cummins Engine Company was now a diesel company with no product, no customer, and no profit, a condition it would remain in incredibly for years to come. W.G. Irwin kept writing checks. Over the following decade and a half, the Irwin family poured what amounted to millions of Depression-era dollars into Clessie's conviction. The company would not record its first profitable year until 1937, 18 years after its founding. Let that sink in. 18 years. Every semi-truck on an American interstate today exists because one Indiana banking family refused for 18 consecutive unprofitable years to stop believing a self-taught mechanic. But belief needed proof, and by 1929, Clessie was running out of road. The company's marine engine business, diesels for yachts, was drying up, and the stock market crash was about to erase the yacht-owning class entirely. Orders vanished. The company was, once again, dying. So Clessie Cummins did what he would do for the rest of his life when the numbers turned against him. He went looking for a stage. In late 1929, Clessie bought a used Packard limousine. He chose it for one reason. The Packard had the longest engine compartment of anything he could find, and even then, his Model U marine diesel went in with, by his own telling, about 3/8 of an inch to spare. It was, as far as anyone can establish, the first diesel-powered automobile in America. On Christmas Day, 1929, Clessie took W.G. Irwin for a ride in it. The old banker had spent a decade watching his money disappear into this company. Now he sat in a limousine being pushed down an Indiana road by an engine built for boats, smooth enough, quiet enough, real enough. Whatever was said in that car, the checkbook stayed open. Then came New York. The National Automobile Show, January 1930, the biggest stage in the American car world. Clessie's plan was pure showman: drive the diesel Packard from Indianapolis to New York City, tip off the newspapers, and let the fuel receipts do the talking. He and his chief engineer, Hans Knudsen, set out on January 4, wired their progress to the press along the way, and rolled into Manhattan on schedule. Roughly 800 miles, averaging over 30 miles an hour at better than 30 miles per gallon. Total fuel cost, $1.38. Call it $1.39, sources split by a penny, and honestly, at that price, who's counting? And then, the great irony of this channel's whole catalog playing out in miniature. When Clessie arrived at the auto show, they refused to let him in. He hadn't registered in advance. the doors of the American automobile establishment were closed to the diesel, literally. So Clessie rented a storefront directly across the street from the show and parked the Packard in the window with the fuel bill on display. The car the auto show banned became one of the most talked about exhibits in New York that January, from the wrong side of the street. The establishment would spend the next 20 years learning that keeping Clessie Cummins out of the building never once kept him out of the newspapers. What followed was the stretch Clessie himself later called his Barnum and Bailey days, a one-man publicity war waged with fuel receipts and stopwatches. In 1930, he took a diesel to the sands of Daytona Beach and set an official diesel speed record. In 1931, he came back with something better, a race car built from a Duesenberg chassis with the Model U marine diesel bolted in and pushed the record to 100.755 miles per hour, the first time a diesel had officially broken 100. A furnace oil engine doing 3-digit speeds on the same beach where the fastest gasoline machines on Earth ran. And then, Indianapolis, the place where he'd stood in the pits as a young man in 1911. For the 1931 Indianapolis 500, Cummins entered that diesel Duesenberg, nearly 3,400 pounds of it, powered by 4 cylinders and roughly 85 horsepower, giving away enormous speed to every purpose-built racing engine in the field. Dave Evans drove it. The car qualified near the back, ran the race at an average of just over 86 miles an hour, and finished 13th. 13th doesn't sound like a headline. Here's the headline. The Cummins Diesel Special ran the entire 500 miles without a single pit stop. No fuel, no nothing. First car in the history of the Indianapolis 500 to do it. Every gasoline car in that race stopped and drank. The diesel just ran. In one afternoon, in front of the biggest crowd in American sports, Clessie had demonstrated the entire commercial argument for the diesel engine: range, economy, indestructibility, without saying a word. Now he needed to make that argument where it actually counted, on the road, with a truck, against the clock. Quick pause. If you're getting something out of this, hit subscribe. Engine Files opens a story like this every week. Engines that were banned, buried, or bet on when nobody else would. Okay, because now comes the run the title promised. By the summer of 1931, General Motors held the coast-to-coast truck endurance record, set, naturally, with gasoline. Just under 104 hours of running time, New York to Los Angeles. Beat that with a diesel, Clessie reasoned, and no fleet owner in America could ignore the fuel numbers ever again. The machine they prepared in Indianapolis was less a truck than a rolling siege engine. A Cummins diesel in a purpose-fitted chassis. Sources describe it variously as an Indiana truck or a Marion. The company's own history says Indiana truck, and we'll go with them. In the cargo body, 2 bunks, a storage bin, and a cooking stove. Because the plan was brutal in its simplicity, the truck would not stop moving. 3 men would rotate, driving, sleeping, cooking, around the clock. The crew was Clessie himself, Dave Evans, the same man who'd just driven 500 miles at Indy without a pit stop, and Ford Moyer. The Continental Oil Company signed on to supply fuel along the route and, in one of history's great sponsorship clauses, at least 1 hot meal a day. And the cargo? The Indy race car itself. The diesel Duesenberg rode across America in the back, part ballast, part traveling billboard. A diesel truck hauling a diesel race car, hunting a gasoline record. They rolled out of New York City at midnight, August 10, 1931. Remember what coast-to-coast meant in 1931. There was no interstate highway system. That was a quarter-century away, and when it finally got built, it would be Cummins-powered machinery that moved the dirt. There were paved stretches, gravel stretches, dirt stretches, and stretches that were mostly an opinion. Rural bridges were built for wagons and Model Ts. An earlier transcontinental truck run was said to have collapsed more than 40 bridges and culverts on its way across. At one point, the Cummins crew came to a bridge that had been officially condemned and drove over it anyway. At another, they skipped the bridge entirely and forded the stream. The mechanical drama started early. Crossing the Allegheny Mountains, the brakes began to fade. File that detail away because it's about to become the most important detail in this entire story. In southern Illinois, the cooling system sprang a leak and the engine overheated. The crew patched it in magnificent Depression fashion with wooden shingles pulled off a roadside shed. In St. Louis, a fresh fuel pump was rushed up from the factory in Columbus. Through the Southwest, they punched into sandstorms. 3 men, driving in shifts, eating off a camp stove at 50 miles an hour, wiring their split times back to New York from prearranged checkpoints like a slow-motion prize fight. And then, at the far end of the country, came the mountain. Cajon Pass, the gateway from the Mojave Desert down into the Los Angeles Basin. 35 miles of descent, 4,000 feet of elevation loss. The truck's brakes, already cooked crossing the Appalachians and worked for 3,000 miles since, were by now largely a rumor. A heavy truck, a heavy race car strapped in the back, a marathon-weary crew, and one of the longest downhill grades in the American West, with, functionally, no way to slow down. They rode it out, white-knuckled, essentially brakeless, 35 miles down from Cajon Summit to San Bernardino, using the gearbox and nerve and whatever friction the brakes had left. It worked, barely. And in the driver's seat, somewhere on that grade, Clessie Cummins felt something that lodged in his engineer's brain and would not leave. The engine itself, this massive compression machine, was full of untapped stopping power. If you could just make the compression work against the truck instead of for it. Hold that thought for 25 years. The truck rolled into Los Angeles with a running time of 97 hours and 20 minutes, beating the General Motors gasoline record by 6 hours and 39 minutes. 3,214 miles at an average of just over 43 miles an hour, returning 15.75 miles per gallon from an engine hauling serious weight. And the number that made the newspapers, the number that made the whole insane trip worthwhile, the number fleet owners clipped out and pinned to office walls. Total fuel cost, $11.22. Furnace oil, about 1/3 of a cent per mile. The equivalent gasoline bill would have been several times that, and every trucking accountant in America could do that multiplication across a fleet and across a year. The diesel truck had just stopped being a theory. The dominoes started falling almost immediately. That same year, 1931, Cummins introduced the Model H, the company's first engine designed from a clean sheet, not for boats, not for generators, but for trucks. Out on the West Coast, W.G. Irwin owned a controlling stake in the Purity Store's grocery chain, and its delivery fleet became a rolling laboratory, Cummins diesels hauling groceries over California mountain grades that routinely humiliated gasoline trucks. The fuel ledgers did the preaching. In 1933 came the moment the industry made it official. Kenworth, up in Seattle, became the first American truck manufacturer to offer a diesel engine as a factory option, America's first production diesel truck, a Cummins in the frame. One builder at a time, one fleet at a time, through the 30s, the heresy became the option became the recommendation, and the recommendation became the industry. Clessie, meanwhile, could not stop performing. In 1934, he went back to Indianapolis with 2 diesel Duesenbergs, one 4-stroke, one 2-stroke, as a live experiment. The 2-stroke smoked so viciously and seized so decisively that Clessie walked away with a company doctrine that holds to this day. Cummins builds 4-strokes, period. In 1935, he dropped a diesel into an Auburn, one of the most glamorous automobiles in America, and drove it coast to coast on $7.63 of fuel, better than 44 miles per gallon. The stunts kept working, the engines kept selling, and in 1937, the impossible finally happened. 18 years in, the Cummins Engine Company turned a profit. Then the Second World War turned the diesel from a business into an arsenal, powering the equipment, generating power, moving materiel, and a generation of soldiers and mechanics came home in 1945 fluent in compression ignition. The post-war trucking boom that built modern America ran, to an enormous degree, on engines from Columbus, Indiana. By the 1950s, the argument Clessie had been making since 1919 wasn't an argument anymore. It was just how trucks worked, which makes what happened to Clessie himself all the harder to watch. Success professionalized the company, and professionalized companies have limited patience for founders who think like showmen and invent like lightning. Through the post-war years, control of Cummins' engine consolidated under the Irwin family's rising generation, and Clessie, the founder, the namesake, the man whose fuel receipts built the market, found himself progressively eased away from the center of his own company. By the mid-1950s, he was out of operational life entirely, resettled in California. Officially honored, practically sidelined. And it's there, in that exile, that the Cajon Pass descent finally paid off. Clessie had never let go of that idea from 1931, the brakeless mountain, the engine full of wasted stopping power. Now he worked it out properly. Modify the valve timing so that, on demand, the engine releases its compressed air at the top of the stroke instead of getting a power stroke back. The engine becomes a giant air compressor absorbing the truck's momentum. An engine brake. Every long grade in America would become safer. Brake fires and runaway truck ramps would become rarer. It's the invention of a man who once rode 35 miles downhill praying. He offered it to the company that bore his own name. They turned it down. The reasons were the usual corporate reasons: priorities, skepticism, not invented here, and accounts of the details vary. What isn't in dispute is what happened next. Clessie took the design to the Jacobs Manufacturing Company in Connecticut, and in 1960 it reached the market as the Jacobs engine brake, the Jake brake. That deep, ripping stutter you hear when a loaded semi comes down a grade, the sound so distinctive that towns put up signs about it, is Clessie Cummins' last great invention. Born on Cajon Pass in 1931, wearing another company's name because his own company said no. He died in 1968. By then, the industry he'd been laughed at for predicting was simply called trucking. One more thread, because this is Engine Files, and you know how we feel about engines and rule books. In 1952, Cummins went back to Indianapolis one final time with a low-slung turbocharged diesel special and put it on pole position, the fastest qualifier in the field, a diesel truck engine outrunning every purpose-built racing engine in America. It retired mid-race when the turbo inlet choked on track debris, and shortly afterward the rulemakers revised the equivalency formulas in ways that made a competitive diesel effectively impossible at the speedway. The diesel never raced at Indy again. Dominate quietly, and racing ignores you. Dominate loudly, and racing reaches for the rulebook. If you've seen our flathead file, you know the pattern, and the 1952 pole car deserves and will get a full file of its own. Think about the full arc of this thing. An engine invented by a man who vanished off a ship in 1913, dismissed for decades as too heavy, too crude, too marine for the road. A self-taught Indiana chauffeur who believed otherwise, and a small-town banker who financed that belief through 18 years without a single profitable one. A company saved from death not by a sales force, but by spectacle. A limousine banned from the auto show and exhibited across the street, a race car that ran 500 miles without stopping, and a truck with bunk beds and a cook stove that crossed the United States in under 100 hours of running time on $11.22 of furnace oil. The truck run didn't just set a record, it rewrote the economics of moving freight in America, a third of a cent per mile multiplied by every fleet, every route, every year since. Kenworth made it a product in 1933. The war made it a standard. The interstates, built by Cummins-powered iron, made it a civilization. There are very few machines you can point to and honestly say the modern supply chain runs on this. The diesel truck is one. It starts in Columbus, Indiana. And here's the last irony. The one that gets me every time. The man who proved the diesel could cross a continent was nearly killed by the one thing his truck couldn't do: stop. He carried that half hour of terror for 25 years, turned it into the engine brake, and was refused by the very company his name was on. So the safety device born from the great Cummins truck run of 1931 went into history under somebody else's name. Every trucker in America knows the words Jake brake. Almost none of them know it should, by rights, have been called a Cummins. Today, Cummins is a Fortune 500 giant, the red engine in millions of trucks, the badge diesel pickup owners wear like a family crest. Clessie's diesel Duesenberg and the artifacts of the Barnum and Bailey days sit in museums. And on any long western grade, any night of the year, you can hear his 1931 mountain descent echoing back at you off the canyon walls, 8 cylinders at a time. And there you have it. America had no diesel trucks in 1929, so Clessie Cummins built one, got banned from the auto show, outran General Motors across an entire continent on pocket change, gave trucking its engine, and gave truckers their brake. Not bad for a chauffeur. If you drove a Cummins or wrenched on one or grew up falling asleep to Jake brakes on a highway grade, tell me in the comments which engine was it and what did diesel cost when you started driving. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We open a new file every week.